Time now to talk you through the Sunday papers. Here I'm joined today by community editor and columnist at The National, Shona Craven, and Matthew Stadlen, presenter and writer. So very nice to see both of you. So let's get stuck in. We're going to start with The Observer. Shona, you've picked this out. This is our top story today, the announcement from the Foreign Secretary of a new load of aid for Gaza, plus the involvement of the Royal Navy.
Yes, so this is following on from the killing of aid workers last week, which obviously prompted outrage. So it's about the Royal Navy being ordered into action to bring in this aid. However, there are concerns, of course, that this may come. It may be too little, too late, given the suspension of some of the aid that was supposed to come this week.
They're talking about May, I think, for some of this to arrive, aren't they?
Yes. Well, we've got sort of separate issues here, which is that there is a new channel to be opened up, but timescales are difficult. I mean, the actual deliveries that were interrupted were being delivered to a sort of makeshift jetty that was built out of rubble, which gives you a sense of just how desperate the situation is. So it's about trying to establish how this can be delivered in a way that won't be intercepted, and obviously the grave risk to aid workers, especially given what we've learned about how these workers came to be killed. So yes, it's talking about, as Cameron says, the situation in Gaza is dire and the prospect of famine is real. We remain desperately committed to getting aid to those who so desperately need it.
Well, yes, and I think in the aftermath of those aid workers being killed, a number of agencies suspended their work in the immediate aftermath. So there are questions about when they can start operating again. We've also had last week the announcement of new aid routes, one of which is the opening up of the Ashdod port, which UK aid may go into, or it may use this temporary pier that the Americans have talked about opening up, but still no details about these new humanitarian routes and how they're going to operate. So still a lot of questions despite various announcements.
Yeah, and in the Sunday Times, David Cameron, Lord Cameron, has actually written a piece, and this marks the 6-month anniversary of the horrific attacks on October the 7th. And in it, David Cameron, I mean, he gets there slowly because he's a diplomat, he's our most senior diplomat, and there's some support for Israel in there, but towards the end of the article, he becomes quite critical. And he suggests, I think, that not enough has been done when it was promised to be done on aid, and it needs to be done now. So that's a warning, I think, to Netanyahu. The problem for those of us who are deeply concerned about the nearly 2 million Palestinians who've been displaced in this conflict is that despite the toughening of the rhetoric, we're yet to see huge or significant changes when, as we've already discussed, so many Palestinians are said to be on the brink of famine. So it's a very, very concerning situation.
Yeah, what do you make of this, Shona? Because, as you say, Matthew, in the Sunday Times, Lord Cameron is using quite tough language, critical over the killing of the aid workers. He said there's no doubt where the blame lies, this must never happen again. But he also says UK support is not unconditional. And it's kind of an echo of what we heard from President Biden at the end of last week as well. We're told that there was a pretty tough phone call that went on between Biden and Netanyahu, and it was not long after that, a matter of hours, that we got an announcement of new humanitarian routes. So do you think that the toughening of language can make a tangible difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of awful to be sort of, analysing the minute details of shifts in language when you're faced with this situation, when it's such a life and death situation for the people who are trapped in Gaza, for, politicians to be just making the odd tweak here and there to their language. It doesn't feel very significant. And of course, all these announcements about aid come against an increasing backdrop of demands for the UK to stop arming Israel. These comments today come off the back of Boris Johnson writing his column in the Daily Mail, obviously former Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. So it has to all be taken in that context. But yes, the language shifts are significant, this notion of it not being unconditional, the support for Israel, especially when you see something like aid workers trying to help these people being killed in the process.
I think there's a strong sense that Netanyahu has not really been listening, or if he has been listening to America, which is Israel's most important ally, he hasn't been acting on it. I mean, don't forget, in the immediate aftermath, Biden took this extraordinary step for a serving US president and flew out to Israel. And while he offered them enormous support and solidarity, he also did warn them as a friend not to make the same sort of mistakes that America had made effectively in the aftermath of 9/11. Israel plunged knee-deep into this conflict. It's 6 months on. There's no sign that it has actually properly defeated Hamas. Vast numbers of people, if we're to believe the Hamas-run health agency in Gaza, have died. And so there's a real concern that Israel is not listening to its allies and that it is alienating world opinion. So not only are enormous numbers of Palestinian civilians suffering, not only are enormous numbers of Palestinian civilians, many of them women and children, dead, but Israel doesn't, the argument goes, seem to be acting in its own self-interest.
Well, yeah, families of the hostages protesting every Saturday, but protesting yesterday and trying to put pressure on Netanyahu.
And don't forget, Netanyahu was in deep political trouble before this conflict began. So you might say that the longer the war goes on, the longer his political career is extended.
Let's move on to the front page of the Mail on Sunday, Shona, because they are putting pressure once again on Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner, and this is over the sale of her house in 2015. Now, the Mail, amongst some of her critics, are suggesting that she should have paid capital gains tax on the sale of that house. She says she's in the clear, she's done nothing wrong. She says she's had legal advice or tax advice to say that she doesn't need to. So what's the Mail on Sunday saying today?
So yeah, this story just isn't going away, and what the Mail have done is comb through all her social media posts going back quite a long time to try and argue that her real home was the home that she actually shared with her husband.
And the significance there is if you sell your main residence, you don't have to pay capital gains tax.
Yes.
The house that she sold, she said was her main residence. The Mail on Sunday is saying, no, it wasn't. You were living with your husband in another house.
Exactly. And there's also the question of being registered on the electoral roll at an address which should be your main address as well. So what they've actually done is they've found pictures, quite a lot, including cats, which I think a lot of people might think wherever you lay your cat, that's your home. And so can you argue that you're not really living here if in all these posts where you're talking about I'm home now, I'm blah, 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 that is where it is? And of course, we've got all this online information such as property listings when things are sold, so you can essentially virtually snoop into the house and say, well, that's the wallpaper, that's the carpet, I know where that is. And the Mail have also managed to find a curtain twitcher to accuse Angela Rayner of being an effing liar because she says that's where she was living. Now, the actual sums of money involved here are small. The amount of capital gains tax that would have been due, I think, was about £1,500. In Scotland, we're certainly very familiar with people being brought down over scandals which relate to very, very, sometimes as little as £600 to do with a donation or a few hundred or £1,000 in expenses. But it's obviously here the principle of the matter. Was she trying to gain an advantage by doing this? And has she then misrepresented the situation afterwards, regardless of whether it's a very small amount of
I'm just going to, before you, I know you want to come in, Matthew, but just before you do, I'm just going to say what the Labour Party is saying about this. They are saying Angela and her husband mutually decided to maintain their existing residence to reflect their family's circumstances, and they shared childcare responsibilities. Angela has always made clear she also spent time at her husband's property when they had children and got married. She was perfectly entitled to do so, and she continues to say, I've done absolutely nothing wrong, and I've had the advice to confirm that.
And that may well turn out to be the case. I mean, there's a sense, isn't there, of this being a witch hunt. However, the wider problem is, or the wider issues are, we're now getting a taste of what life might be like if Labour do go on, as the polls suggest, and win the election, which is they will, quite rightly, be put under extreme scrutiny. I mean, I'm just thinking back to Partygate, for example, when left-leaning commentators such as myself were all over the government, and I don't regret that at all. The Mirror was coming out with story after story. So we have to expect the same level of scrutiny to be applied to Labour. Whether or not it turns out that she has actually done something wrong, we don't know, but it's not looking ideal.
Okay, yeah, and she says she doesn't need to publish the legal advice that she's had because it's a private matter. So we'll wait to see whether that position changes. Let's quickly take a look at the front of the Sunday Telegraph. I think, Matthew, you were particularly keen to talk about this, and it's about a criticism of the government over its defence spending.
Yes, so James Heappey was the Conservative Minister for the Armed Forces for 4 years. So he was right at the heart of Britain's defence for a good chunk of time. He's only been out of the job and he stepped down a couple of weeks ago, and he's already putting the knife into the government, and presumably he thinks this is the right thing to do because our national self-interest is, our national security no less, is at risk. He doesn't think that we are doing enough as a country, that the government is doing enough in its totality to protect ourselves in the event of some horror war against Russia. None of us can almost even imagine what that would be like, but he's suggesting only really the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, was taking this seriously when there could have been a sort of cross-governmental initiative to prepare for such an event.
Okay, yes, and interesting to see what the response might be to that. But obviously, Jeremy Hunt might say money is tight. Anyway, we're out of time. There is actually a series. Our defence editor, Is Britain Prepared for War, online, which people might be interested in that as well. See you next hour.